The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Yat Siu, the entrepreneur, investor, business leader, and gaming pioneer. You started your career at Atari Games at the tender age of 13 and went on to found the digital media development company Outblaze. In 2011, you co-founded Animoca, which provided gaming applications to the emerging smartphone market and has since become a world leader in entertainment, gamification, and blockchain innovation. Animoca Brands is now valued at close to $6 billion after your successful $110 million raise this year. You believe that gamefi represents the future and that NFTs offer a new way for culture to be stored in the digital world. Your plan is to build a global company with a big vision to deliver true digital property rights for all. You believe that NFT games are only scratching the surface of what's possible and that in the future, completely new gaming models will be developed as a result of digital ownership. Yat, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you, and that was an amazing introduction. We're going to have to use that every time.
I always tell people you are the guy to speak to about Web3, gaming, Metaverse, and the future. And honestly, when we spoke a year ago, it was remote because you were in Hong Kong, but I quite frankly didn't understand the Metaverse. And then after our conversation, I actually understood it. And I always tell all my students to watch that one interview because I think you break it down so people can kind of get their head around it. And we got so much to talk about, and I don't know where we start. You know, the last year since we spoke, so much has happened, and of course, the last couple of days, so much has happened.
Yes, indeed.
So, where do we start? We're going to talk the last couple of days, or are we going to talk about the last year?
Well, I mean, I think let's address the elephant in the room, right? Last couple of days, and then let's talk about I think what happened in the last year with NFTs and sort of gaming adoption is really a macro trend that I think we're still just in the beginning of. I think the last few days, obviously, for some people might be considered a little bit traumatic, but I think the very important thing to recognize is that it's a relatively smaller audience that has been affected by this.
Right.
In some ways, you could say that those affected by what happened to FTX are still the people who are generally trading, for instance, are people who are in the financial services side. Whereas when you think about what's happening with blockchain games, with the people who are engaging with culture, with non-fungible tokens, maybe there's some fluctuation in the value for sure, in terms of maybe volumes or in terms of perceived value. However, they didn't go there because of the trading aspect of it or because of the financial services aspect. They entered it because of culture, because of gaming, because of fun, because of entertainment, or because of art, for instance. And that's the long-term trend. In the last year and a half, most people entered blockchain because of NFTs. And it's not because it's the ownership of the NFT, it's because it represents culture, which is how most of us actually engage. We care about traditions, we care about art, we care about identity. But if you think about the history of blockchain, many of the very first generations of people that came in, even though it maybe didn't start this way, are people who came from Wall Street. And so it was very financial in nature. And so everyone measures it in financial ways when that's only one avenue of why digital property rights and blockchain is valuable. But it's not the only way. So on one hand, yes, it's tragic, and we hope things will balance out. And this year has been a tough year, starting from the first part of the year, with Terra, and then afterwards the Three Arrows, and now with FTX. But it's still the same audience, if I may say so, right? It's the same group of people that were affected, and I think also people are becoming more cautious. So maybe the main setback, I would say, is perhaps a reputational damage. Right, I think certainly some of the investors in the space are going to be much more cautious on the financial services side, right? The exchange business, for instance, I think will be looked at with much more scrutiny. But that I don't think is affecting the gaming sector, because gaming is still the fastest growing business sector basically in the world right now when you compare it to other forms of entertainment. It's a $200+ billion industry. It's bigger than music and film combined. It covers the attention of 3.4 billion people and rising. So that is the audience that we're sort of generally targeting, plus of course other people in the online space. That is what matters. And most of them don't trade on Wall Street and they don't trade crypto.
Right. And so this, as tragic as it is and difficult to digest, you're talking about 500,000 to 1 million people that were kind of trading on a platform that this affects. And again, the community knows these people and we meet them at conferences and that kind of thing. But if you want to zoom out and go to 30,000 feet, you're saying there's a lot of other things going on in this space.
Well, what's fascinating? I mean, just now as I'm attending Token 2049, while obviously there's a lot of shock and debate and discussion, the mood isn't really like, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? This is the end of the world. I mean, people are taking photos of alpacas basically running around the conference, excited about opportunities, pitching still, and yeah, maybe this is certainly not the best time to be trying to pitch to raise money because maybe there's some sensitivities. But the thing is, there's still an energy, right? People are still hopeful. And that was very different from 4 years ago. So it's not nearly as bad as I think people think it is, but it certainly has a macro effect that we have to see how it shakes out in the next week or two. But the energy is there. And I would say the same thing, when I went to Korea Blockchain Week, which was, I think it was maybe a month or two after what happened with Terra, and Terra basically being very sort of strong in Korea at the time. Obviously, many people in Korea were affected. The general commentary I got from a lot of people was, oh, don't bother going to Korea. Everyone's against it, it's bad, and so on. And certainly many people suffered, and that's really bad. But at the conference, the energy was electric. Everyone was like, yeah, that's bad, that's really bad, but we're here to build, we're excited. Many young people understand that was, where the future was going. This was the future they wanted to build. The true builders were emerging. So, I would say that it's a true test of strength, that no matter how hard you shake sort of the tree, it's still standing there.
Yeah, and I felt that energy yesterday as well. I mean, obviously people were talking about it, but everybody was still buzzing and talking and moving, and I get a feeling of crowds. I'm sure you do as well. And there wasn't this like ghost-faced, pale, yes, what are we going to do now thing. It was just everybody was getting on with it, and it was like, yeah, that kind of sucks, and we didn't see this happening, and but everybody's building.
Yes.
And continue to move on. That's a testament to the space.
Yes, exactly.
To finish up with the year in review, you mentioned Terra Luna. I guess we saw Celsius failing in Voyager. Like, what are some of the benchmarks to review them now? What your thoughts were on them, and then I'd love to talk about bigger picture.
I mean, so first of all, I think when you look at the financial sector, right, when you think about what happened basically with those sort of financial service providers, they definitely suffered, and I think there will be probably a little bit more pain to come from them because there is going to be a contagion because they typically do business with each other, right? It's a sort of a network effect of a different kind. But the other stat we should basically look at for this year is, what went into Web3 investments. Billions of dollars just in Web3 gaming investments in these last 3 quarters, over $3 billion. And the entire space itself, I think, was, maybe even double that in the area of Web3. And we're not talking about just the first half year. We're talking about even just the last quarter. I think it was just $1.8 billion invested in the space. Now, obviously, it's not, maybe it wasn't how it was, at the end of last year, but that's a pretty healthy investment figure, right? So that's one of the sort of, I would say, look at the optimism that we see with the investment community as well as the community at large. Take a look at, for instance, what happened when NFTs were dropped to the Reddit community and what that did for interested people in the adoption. This is the year in which ApeCoin, for instance, launched as well, which was, and many of sort of really fascinating sort of blockchain games came out. So that's exciting. And then on the policy side as well, places like Hong Kong, which always was viewed in the past as, is it kind of like a policy like China? Are they anti-crypto? Has come up with a sort of virtual asset regime, embracing basically digital assets, talking about the fact that retail should be able to trade crypto, for instance, right? I mean, that's a big change, right? And then more importantly, when I was having dinner at the end of the sort of session with the sort of the Secretary for Financial Services, a minister in Hong Kong, Secretary of Financial Services in the Treasury, he showed up in a punk outfit. So of course I had to match it with my Bored Ape outfit, both from Vivian Tam, who is a Hong Kong fashion designer making NFT-based fashion, right? But she's a global fashion icon, right? So and she showed that in, for instance, New York Fashion Week. So So it's almost like you have two parallel worlds, right? Where you have one area where the world of sort of, let's call it, metaverse, blockchain, Web3 culture, despite everything, is continuing to rock, is continuing to go really sort of, full on. And yes, the markets are sort of, volatile, but, they're soldiering on and they're super excited about it. And then, of course, you have a little bit on the sort of, let's say, pure financial side, maybe some people who are, of course, concerned. But one thing is it definitely proves once more is actually, the decentralized platforms are fine. It's the centralized platforms that failed. The centralized platforms need to basically be watched over differently, clearly, as we have seen, because we can't see what's going on. Whereas the decentralized ones are transparent, they're open, you see everything, and therefore you can have more trust in those systems. So I think there is a silver lining around people understanding self-custody much more, around people understanding the value, or at least managing their risk differently, and appreciating actually what the value of true decentralization really is.
Yeah, I remember a few months ago when Celsius failed, Dan Moorhead from Pantera Capital, who's been on the show, wrote an article that basically said DeFi worked.
That's right.
Look what it worked. And it was funny because you could see Celsius trying to liquidate some of their positions through and all the DeFi protocols were working. They were pieces of computer code that had collateral locked in, and you couldn't get it out unless you did the thing you were supposed to do. Yes. And that was the big message, although to the public it didn't work. But if you drove down, it was the centralized finance.
Correct.
And it's all the same things that happen when humans get involved with balance sheets where there's leverage, and this has happened in the financial industry for centuries.
Yes.
And it just happened again
yes.
in the last 2 days, and it happened a few times before. So you're right, DeFi worked, and maybe we're getting proven these lessons. Like putting your hand on the stove sometimes, that's just showing you, okay, custody lessons, DeFi lessons as well. And we have to learn going forward.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned the thing about Hong Kong, and I just want to spend a little more time on it because I think it's important. First of all, you're a Hong Kong native. You love, not native, I mean, you obviously grew up in Austria, but you call it your home.
It's my home, yes.
You're a Hong Konger, I would say.
That's right, yes.
And you guys are an interesting lot. You guys stick together. You're a real specific type of person. But talk to me about this policy because, we'd heard a couple years ago that China was banning crypto, and now they've come out with this very kind of like pro-crypto area for Hong Kong to move forward, and everyone's like, wait a second, is this right? I just saw the latest conference for the Communist Party where it seems as if they're going away from some of the capitalistic ideas, and I'm trying to get this in my head. So you're on the ground. What's really happening?
Well, I think one of the things that most people don't appreciate is that Hong Kong has always been this very liberal capitalist environment, where if you think about it historically, it's always been the trade center really in and out of, for China. It's still the only place in which you can do renminbi, for instance, exchanges. It's a place where you can do certain kind of global financial instruments and free sort of movement of money that you can't do in China. So Hong Kong has always served this role. One of the problems that we've had really for Hong Kong, sadly, for the last couple of years is COVID. And because Hong Kong basically took a very aggressive COVID policy, people can't come to Hong Kong to see what's real and what isn't. And so the only thing you can do is see what the media is saying. And in the last couple of years, I think the media has been somewhat unkind to Hong Kong and sort of created the association that Hong Kong is China. And while, of course, Hong Kong is a part of China, it is still a separate place. It has its own laws. I can get the BBC, right? I can do all the things that we can do in the free world. And that includes crypto. Now, the difference about sort of digital assets before is there wasn't a policy direction for a while. And so people simply assumed that whatever the policy you have in China must therefore also be in Hong Kong. And this completely sort of demonstrates that that's not the case. And in fact, Hong Kong was never at this point, never like this anyway. The exciting thing is that Hong Kong has basically demonstrated that they want to have virtual asset leadership. I think that's exciting for a couple of reasons. One, that we have a new global financial player that's basically saying, we're here to make this space better. We are invested in space. And you should have seen the conference. I was there basically opening it up with, the first fireside chat was between me and the Secretary of Financial Services and Treasury, and we talked about sort of what that meant for Hong Kong. The room was packed, right? It was electric. The excitement was there. Everyone was really wow, Hong Kong is embracing the future. And it was really kind of Hong Kong is ready for business. And for me, living in Hong Kong, it was very beautiful to see as well, because Hong Kong was being unfairly crushed, by other factors, including sort of media perceptions. And now you can come to Hong Kong, right, and then see it for yourself, but also benefit from these new policies that they're engaging. They've also come out, for instance, with this sort of quasi-sovereign fund. which again is a very Hong Kong thing, but they're like, hey, we want to kickstart the industry. If you're from overseas and you're building this new area of business that's developing, in the future of finance or fintech, for instance, Hong Kong has a fund available for you to look at that as well, right? So they're really sort of taking sort of a very proactive stance. I also think that it's going to have repercussions globally, right? In the sense that for a long time, well, I think we can make a safe assumption that Hong Kong probably didn't do this without some sort of blessing, right? I mean, they don't just make policies by themselves, which means that there is a macro perspective here around the fact that this is the way in which I think China is sort of experimenting and understanding, in this financial laboratory that Hong Kong always was for the region, which is a message for the rest of the world. Because if China is now playing with this in a way, then how should other places react to it? Are you willing to basically sort of just let sort of Hong Kong play in this part? Or do you want to actually also make sure that that talent that is basically the future of finance and maybe the future of the web as a whole, is something that we need to be globally active in, and which I think is going to be a positive thing. But Asia has been leading in this space from a regulatory standpoint this year as well. When we talk about this year, for instance, Japan, right? Prime Minister Kishida-san made Web3 in the Metaverse national agenda about 3-4 months ago. Mm-hmm. We announced sort of a partnership where Mitsubishi Group, Mitsubishi Bank basically made an investment in Animoca Japan, for instance. But aside from the fact that you have basically Japan's biggest bank may sort of invest in us in Japan for building Web3, is very much an indication where as a nation they want to go, right? And I think this also is really exciting. So the region is waking up to this, and I think the rest of the world, especially America, which I think leads from the innovation entrepreneurship side, but maybe on the regulatory side and maybe on the government side is still a little uncertain about what to do, is now probably having to react to this, which I think is good because we need some global competition. We need some other forces that can help shape the market.
So this is your message to Washington, D.C.
Well,
they should pay attention to what's happening in Hong Kong.
Well, I mean, I think that generally speaking, there is a lot of people in, I think, the U.S., especially in politics as well, who do want to see this develop, right? So it's not fair to say that, American politics is against it. But there's definitely division around it, which is very clear, right? And I think one of the things to think about is what do they, the lesson is, well, why is Japan focusing on this? Why is Hong Kong, or maybe by definition, China, for instance, looking at this? Why do they think it's important? Maybe what are we not seeing that we should understand better? I think that is the message here, because we all recognize that there's different perspectives that have great value to each other.
And so does something happen in Hong Kong without China knowing about it or being involved?
Well, I mean, certainly many things would happen in Hong Kong without sort of China knowing about it. But when it comes to financial policy, when it comes to regulatory policy, I do find it, again, I have no confirmation of this, but I do find it very difficult to believe that this wasn't done with any kind of appropriate consultation, because after all, this has a big effect, I think, on the direction of where Hong Kong is going to go.
Right, and I might ask my friends down the road here in Parliament here in London to also open their eyes to that.
Well, I mean, your new Prime Minister
Yeah.
Appears to be, at least historically, very positive towards this, which I think is also interesting. And I think the UK, I think from a legal perspective, is now actually, I was reading somewhere that they were really looking at digital property rights as something, to look at from a legal perspective, which before they haven't considered. So I am, it is beginning, right? And so I'm actually quite hopeful about this. And I think these are the kind of developments that have happened this year that really isn't spoken about much, because we're all focused on the blow-ups, right? We're all focused on sort of the drama of what's happening in sort of, what happened to SPF or what happened to Three Arrows. But actually, the inner workings of the stuff that's laying the groundwork, the policy work, the fact that governments are pushing this, for instance, that's not spoken about enough. But that's the real powerful stuff, because at the end of the day, the stuff that we're reading in the media only, affects a small percentage, a small population of the world. What will affect, the rest of the world in a big way is policy.
Right. Yeah, and you're right. Rishi Sunak is traditionally pro-crypto. The UK, which has traditionally lagged a bit in major blockchain developers being located here. We've got Aave, you guys, Animoca just opened up an office.
That's
here,
right. We just announced it yesterday. Had an opening.
Yeah, congratulations on that. Welcome.
Thank you.
We welcome you here.
Yes. And we love it here.
Yeah, it's a great place to be. Obviously, a traditional financial capital. Great history. Does Brexit hurt us when it comes to bringing talent in there? We'll see. Hopefully we continue bringing talent, but I always worry about that. So that's good to see. Let's just mention, while we're on DC for now, you've probably watched the American policy change a lot even in the last few years. And people argue now that the next presidential candidate will probably be pro-crypto. And that now to run for office in America, it's probably smarter to be pro-crypto because they've kind of looked at the audience, and most people, would rather have a candidate that is pro-crypto. It's the best way to get elected. Now, I ran for mayor of London here in 2021, and I realized that all candidates care about two things: votes and money. And if they believe that the people really want that, it seems like they might change policies. Now, that might contrast with Gary Gensler, who is in the SEC, who's in an appointed position, but also that can change over time. And so I was just curious about your perspective of policy in America, where it might be going.
So I think the policy aspect in America, at least from our own observation, relates a little bit to sort of where the sentiment lies. I think less about crypto, although crypto is part of the narrative, but more about capitalism. So my perspective as to what's happening in America is a little bit sort of this war on capitalism between, let's say, the younger generation versus the older generation, who very much sort of are, let's call it, thinking about sort of, the elements of, why capitalism is important, the property rights and the freedom aspect, and related to sort of, I guess, the meaning behind, why we basically need to have, I guess, relatively smaller government and perhaps, less controls, as an example. Whereas I think, the recent study, and actually studies in the last couple of years, have revealed that, I think most Americans under the age of, I think it was 30, actually are socialist leaning. And this idea that Americans could even talk about socialism 10 years ago would have just, probably had you kicked out of the country, right? And now it's a political movement, and it's not just culminated or actually developed things like Bernie Sanders, who are all, by the way, well-meaning, right? The whole point is that they see a problem. Right? Young people don't really have an opportunity in America the way that they sort of their parents' generation had, for instance. The opportunity wasn't there. So capitalism hasn't worked for them. So the consequence, therefore, is that when we think about the backlash that we see this, for instance, in gaming, sort of non-fungible tokens and sort of, I guess, blockchain in gaming is very much popular in Asia, right? I mean, all the Korean and even Japanese game companies in Southeast Asia are all embracing it right now and saying this is the future and building towards it. Obviously we're in Hong Kong, but we're a global business and we can see the numbers grow. Whereas in America, if you remember last year, big gaming companies like EA were like, oh, NFTs and blockchain, that's really interesting. And then, a big vocal minority of gamers were like lashing against it. Our feeling is that this isn't so much about, this fear of sort of introducing a new technology as much as it's a fear of introducing capitalism, which hasn't worked for them in the real life, basically into the digital world, which is basically where most of their time and attention is, where they actually have, where their society is, where their friends are, and where they aren't judged necessarily by how much money they have, because that is what is happening in the real world. And I think this anti-capitalist movement that we're seeing in America is, what is crypto? Crypto is digital capitalism as far as they're concerned. So digital capitalism, like Bitcoin and the crypto bros is all bad, and non-fungible tokens is just covered basically in that whole area because they think that, it's like thinking that, every NFT is like a Lamborghini to the car industry, right? Like if you buy a car, it must be a Lamborghini. Of course, we know that's not true, but from their perspective, that's what they're thinking. I say this sometimes, where I think the American dream is much more alive and well in Asia than it is in America. And it is somewhat tragic because the American dream is what people around the world aspire to. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that basically Americans generally, the younger generation, are doing worse off, right? And I think this is the political climate. So when we talk about a pro-crypto, let's say, sort of politician emerging, it has to solve with it sort of, and has to explain why actually blockchain and crypto is beneficial for young people, why it becomes more financially inclusive, why it can create more equity. And we believe that very firmly, but with that comes a lesson in capitalism. With that comes a lesson in property rights, which is something that we also have to overcome, as to people understand, oh, what does physical property mean? That's what this means in terms of the ability to have freedom to transact and to have actual economic freedom. Well, the same is true for digital freedom, right? Many of, we spoke about this in the last show, many of the people who use Instagram or even...
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.